Hello, I'm Kelly Tyrey, dietitian and nutrition care manager with Wellspring. I'm excited to be back with you today to talk more about eating well for brain health. I'm doing this in partnership with the Thrive program. So we talked in the last video that I made for you about the MIND diet, which is a research-based way of eating that may slow the rate of cognitive decline with age and also even reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. A cornerstone of that way of eating are whole grains. So we're going to focus on those today, so I hope you can better understand what they are, why they're important, and how to easily incorporate them into your diet. So to start talking about the whole grains and their benefits, we're going to look at a few slides together. The first slide shows you a picture of what whole grains look like. When grains like wheat, oats, and corn grow in the field, they have three main edible parts. One is the fiber-rich outer bran. The second one part is the nutrient-packed inner germ, and then finally you have the starchy endosperm. Foods made with all three of these parts are called whole grains. Foods where the bran and the germ have been removed and only the starchy endosperm remains are called refined grains. Unfortunately, most of the grains you find today in the grocery store are indeed refined. Whole grains are much healthier than refined grains. Some foods contain a mixture of whole and refined grains, so we'll talk about that. So let's look on the second slide together at some examples of what whole grains are. You may see these in the grocery store. Some of them may be new to you, some of them may be something that you've seen before. There are lots of options now. So we'll look at this together. Again, we're looking at slide 2. Anything from oatmeal to things like corn. People don't think about corn being a whole grain, but it indeed is. Barley, amaranth, triticale, wild rice, black rice, bulgur. These are just some examples of things you may see in the grocery store. Now, if they're new to you, you can always try them out. Your family might enjoy them. Most things that you see here, once you cook them, have sort of a nutty flavor that's interesting and different. I think you'll find they taste much different than things like good old white pasta or white rice. There's some more flavor to enjoy. So those are examples of things you may see in the grocery store that are considered whole grains, but what if you're not sure what you're looking for when you go grocery shopping? What I would have you think about is there's some really misleading information in the grocery store on packaging. You'll see things like multigrain, mixed grain, wheat. It may say made with whole grain or 100% wheat. None of those things really mean anything. What you have to do is really look at the label, and there is an easy way, something you can look for in the grocery store that may be very helpful. If we move on to slide 3, you'll see there's a stamp that's on a lot of foods now called the whole grain stamp. That stamp, if you see that on a food package, guarantees that you're getting at least half a serving of whole grain in each serving of that food. So that's kind of a sneaky, easy way to find things in the grocery store that are considered whole grain. The other thing that I would talk to you about, when you go in the grocery store, on the ingredient package or the nutrient facts listing, there'll be a list of ingredients. Things are listed in the order in which they occur in the food. So things that are listed up top in that list of ingredients are there in a larger quantity. So if you see a whole grain mentioned, it could be whole oat, whole wheat, whole corn. Those are in the first 3 or 4 ingredients. That should be really dense in that food, so it should be a good source of whole grain for you. The other sort of easy thing that I would say is that what I'm looking for when I go grocery shopping is just the word whole. If it says whole oat, it says whole wheat, it says whole grain, then you can count on that's the case, and that's a good sign. That's really what I look for when I'm looking at packages in the grocery store, is the word whole. All right, so we've talked about some of the things we're looking for with whole grains in the grocery store, but why am I really talking about this? Why are they more nutritious? We talked about that when foods are grown on farms, like corn and oat and wheat, they're naturally very dense in nutrition. When we take a machine, like we do to put stuff in the grocery store in these convenient packages and process it, we strip away some of the nutrients. The nutrients are much higher in whole grains because they aren't played with. They're left as the way nature made them. So whole grains, to let you know, do have 25% more protein than refined grains. They have 3 times the amount of potassium and zinc. They have 4 times more fiber and 6 times the amount of magnesium. My point being, they're more nutritious for your body. You get more of a bang for your buck out of eating whole grains than you do eating the white version of those foods, okay? So I hope that makes sense so far. We're gonna talk about now, if we were gonna go to the grocery store together, what we would look for. So, if you were with me and we're going in the grocery store today, we probably would start on the bread aisle, because that seems to be the first area when you go in a lot of grocery stores. When you're looking at the foods that are in the bread section, I brought some examples for you of things that are considered whole grain. And how you'll know that is, for example, This is a bread that says 100% whole wheat. Again, you've got that word whole and you've got 100%, so you know that's going to be a good source of whole grain nutrition for you. There are also lots of other varieties of bread that you'll see. This one is another one that is considered whole grain. It doesn't necessarily mention 27 whole grains and seeds, but if I start looking at that ingredient list, like the first 10 or more say whole. So again, you know that that grain that's in there that's mixed together, they're intact, they're not processed. You'll see multi-grain breads and you'll see wheat bread. Don't count on it being whole grain until you read the package. Okay, make sure there's whole in the mix and not just wheat or enriched wheat flour. That's just processed grain. You can also find things like tortillas, buns, English muffins that'll be whole grain for you. And this is another great example. Look on the packaging, it says whole wheat tortillas. Again, that word is key. If you see whole, it's whole grain, okay? So on the bread aisle, there are some really good options for you. And I should say right off the bat, I don't want you to think that everything you eat has to be whole grain. You know, we've said that for the MIND diet, they recommend 3 servings daily. The dietary guidelines would recommend that half of your grains be whole. So if there's some things you try that you don't like that are whole grain, it's okay. If most of your grains, at least half of them are whole grain, that's a really good place to start, okay? So we talked about the bread. We might next move on to like the breakfast and cereal aisle, what things you could look for there. There are all sorts of breakfast cereals available that might sign whole grain and may not be, so I want to give you some good examples. Oatmeal in any form, whether it's instant or slower cooking, is a whole grain. So that's a great choice for you. If you do use the flavored or the instant kind and you're watching your sodium intake or your salt, those will be higher in those foods. The slower cooking ones are going to have none added. So just a heads up about that. But again, any oatmeal is considered whole grain. Grits, unfortunately, unless they are whole grits in whole form, are not going to be a whole grain for you. So I'm going to take those out of the picture. I just wanted to make sure I mention them. They're easy to cook, and yes, they're enjoyable. That could be one of your refined grains for the day, but it's not considered a whole grain as such, okay? Now in your box cereals, things that I would look for, you're going to be looking for, I mentioned earlier, that whole grain stamp. So this is an example of where you would see that. These are Frosted Mini Wheats, or a generic version of that. These are going to be high in fiber for you and a good choice. Grape nuts are another whole grain cereal for you that you could look for. So that's another option. There are all kinds of things available. I did want to point out though that bran cereals, they are loaded with fiber. So if that's a goal of yours, is to add more fiber, they're a great way to do that. But they're not considered a whole grain because you've stripped away the parts of the grain except for that bran. So just to be mindful of that. So again, in the grocery store, there are all kinds of cereal options for you to look for, and a lot of them are going to say whole on there for you. And Raisin Bran is something a lot of people enjoy. If you look at the ingredients there, the first one is whole grain wheat, okay? So again, that's going to be a whole grain choice for you. All right, so maybe for breakfast you wanted to do something quick and easy from the freezer section. There are not a lot of whole grain options when it comes to frozen pancakes and frozen waffles, but they're there. I will tell you, Nutri-Grain waffles are really not a great source of whole grain, but there are options like this that are indeed, if you look right on the packaging, it says 100% whole grains included. What that means for you is more fiber, more nutrition, more protein, as we talked about earlier. So these are going to be a great way to start your day versus the white version of pancakes or waffles. Now in the winter, when we start cooking and baking more for the holidays, I wanted to mention that you can use whole grain flour. It does change the texture a little bit when you're baking, so if you're making your cookies or holiday breads, I really recommend using the white whole wheat flour. It's a little lighter in texture and flavor than the actual whole wheat flour is, and it does a really good job if you want to try substituting that in your recipes. And you can do the same ratio or same amount that you would do from regular white flour, okay? So the enriched flour, white flour, I would use that less and try to use a whole grain flour more often, okay? All right, so let's talk about side items you could find in the grocery store. And my goodness, there are lots of things out there now. It used to pretty much just be only rice and pasta, and now you can kind of find all sorts of things in the grocery store that are considered whole grain. So there are things like buckwheat, quinoa, there's good old farro, which is something a little different. That's an Italian grain. You can see how dark that is in color. Most of these, when you cook them, are going to have a very nutty, good flavor that hopefully you'll enjoy. There are really quick versions of these available of whole grains. Things like this is a mixture of brown and wild rice that you can heat up in the microwave super quick. So that's a good option. This is an example of something you got in your box of food from the Thrive program. This is brown rice, so that's another good option. And there's whole wheat pasta out there. That's easy to find in pretty much every store right now. The trick I'll say about that, whole grain pasta is easy to under or overcook. Undercooked, it tends to be really tough and chewy, and if you cook it too long, it gets all floppy and it's not pleasant. So make sure you cook it till al dente, or just barely cooked. The slower or the less amount of minutes on the packaging. And once you've done that, I think your family will find it doesn't taste that much different once you put the sauce on it. So again, there's some good options out there. Most of your whole grains like this that are side items will cook anywhere from 10 to, it could be even 30 or 40 minutes. Make sure you read the package. And in most examples, you're adding about 1 cup of the product itself to twice that amount of water when you're cooking it. So give some of these a try. Again, it's just fun to try some different grains. Again, the flavor profile is going to be different, and hopefully you'll actually enjoy that. So even with snack times, which you may snack on cereal, which is fine, but there are other snacks in the grocery store that can help you incorporate more whole grain into your diet. Some examples of that would be whole grain crackers. Again, you'll see 100% whole grain on the wheat thins I have here. And Triscuits, 100% whole grain wheat. So these are good examples. And they do have nice flavor. So, if you really like things like saltines, and you don't really prefer whole grain crackers, get your whole grain elsewise, other places. But I think if you try these, you'll find the texture is really good and different. And it will stick with you longer than the white version of these foods too, if you need a snack that sticks with you a little while. You can also get whole grain tortilla chips. How do I know these are whole grain? On the front, you might not really be able to tell, but again, if you go back to the nutrition facts label, the first ingredient is organic whole ground corn, okay? So these are gonna give you a little more fiber and protein than the more refined tortilla chips would. Popcorns is actually a whole grain snack and super easy if that's something you enjoy. And there are some options for things like Nutri-Grain bars and granola bars in the grocery store. These are not particularly my favorite. The first ingredient is indeed whole grain oats, but after that you've got enriched wheat flour. So they're pretty processed if you look at the rest of the ingredients. So not my favorite choice for you. But again, I wanted you to make sure you get the idea that just because it says grain, you can't really count on it being 100% whole grain. You got to read the label a little closer. Can't always just believe the title they give you. All right, so if we were in the grocery store together, those are some of the things that I have you look for and be mindful of. Make sure I didn't forget anything I wanted to tell you about. I did want to say that a lot of the things we talked about today will be included in the box of food you get from the Thrive program, including the oatmeal, the whole wheat pasta, and the rice. So hopefully you'll enjoy those. All right, I should also mention that in addition to being brain healthy, whole grains have additional benefits, including things like helping you manage your weight, lower your blood glucose or blood sugar levels, lower your LDL or your bad cholesterol levels. That's the type of cholesterol that tends to clog arteries, so it's good to have lower levels of that. Whole grains can be a benefit there. Keeping you regular. It may also help prevent with the development of asthma in children. Whole grains may reduce the risk of things like heart disease and stroke and even certain cancers. It may reduce inflammation, which is very helpful. We talked about in our first video that things like Alzheimer's disease and heart disease have been linked to inflammation. So whole grains can help be prevented with that. And whole grains also help keep the gut bacteria in good balance and healthy. So that's also a benefit. So there are lots of reasons to try to include more whole grains in your diet. All right, I hope you've learned more about what whole grains are, what their benefits are, and how to incorporate them into your diet. I hope you'll enjoy trying them out. If you have any questions, they'll include my contact information at the end of the video. Feel free to give me a call or email, and I'll be glad to help with anything I can. Take care, and thank you.